The tablet was already on the table when I walked in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the size of the chamber, which was enormous enough to make a grown man feel like a particle of dust floating in still air. Not the 12 council seats arranged in a perfect crescent, each one occupied by a representative of a species that had been sailing between stars, while humans were still drawing maps of their own coastlines. Not the hum of translation technology woven invisibly into the air itself, converting every breath and syllable into something the assembled galaxy could understand. Not even the sheer weight of it all, the awareness that this room contained more accumulated years of civilization than the entire recorded history of my species. The tablet was already there, waiting, positioned at my side of the table with quiet precision, a crystalline slab carrying the terms of Earth's formal submission. They had not placed it as an invitation. They had placed it as a foregone conclusion. They had not considered, not even for a moment, the possibility that I might not sign it. My name is Kale Voss. At the time of the council's summons, I was 43 years old, a mid-level diplomat with a decent record, a modest reputation, and no particular genius that I was aware of. I had been selected to represent Earth at the first formal session of the Galactic Council not because I was the finest mind humanity could put forward, but because I was, in the precise words of Deputy Director of Interstellar Affairs Clara Neild, experienced enough to be useful and junior enough to be expendable. She had said it almost kindly. I had taken the assignment anyway. What she had not said, and what I only understood later, was that she and the people she reported to had chosen very carefully, and the word expendable had been a courtesy, not a description. The journey from Earth to the council's seat took 11 days aboard a Varathi escort vessel. The Varathi were the dominant species on the council, older than any civilization I had ever encountered in documents or briefings, and they moved through the galaxy with the quiet confidence of people who had long since stopped asking whether they were right about things. My escort, a Varathi officer I knew only by the translated approximation of his name Elithari, spoke to me exactly twice during those 11 days. Once to inform me when meals would be served, once to suggest, in a tone that was polite in its grammar and absolute in its intention, that I should prepare to be cooperative. I had not answered that second statement. I had simply nodded and returned to reading. I spent those 11 days studying every document Earth's intelligence services had compiled on the Galactic Council. The complete file ran to 412 pages. I read it 3 times. By the end of the third reading, I understood 2 things clearly. First, the Council was not a diplomatic body in any sense that a human diplomat would recognize. It did not negotiate. It did not compromise. It administered. It was a management structure built for species that had already accepted, whether by genuine agreement or by the quiet pressure of having no other visible option, that the Council's authority was final. Second, in the entire recorded history of the Council, spanning more than 800 years of documented first contacts and formal integrations, no species had ever refused a submission accord. Every civilization brought before this chamber had signed. Some signed quickly, some signed after delay, some signed after what the records characterized as extended consultations, which I took to mean that someone in their government had been sufficiently persuaded that resistance was not practical. They had all signed. The escort vessel docked at the council station with the smooth certainty of a ship that had made this approach 10,000 times. The station was vast in the way that structures are when they have been built without any financial or material constraint, purely to communicate scale. I was guided through corridors wide enough to drive vehicles through, past observation windows overlooking a transit hub where ships the size of small cities moved through docking lanes. It was beautiful in the way that power is beautiful when it wants you to feel small. I felt small. I let myself feel it, because denying it would have been a lie, and I have always found lies unhelpful in situations where accuracy matters. I felt small, and I kept walking. The chamber itself exceeded anything I had been shown in briefing images. The ceiling was not a ceiling so much as a contained sky, a transparent dome revealing a star system I did not recognize, its light falling in angles that seemed designed to illuminate the crescent of council seats while leaving the single chair in the center, in a slightly dimmer zone. The 12 seats were elevated in a graduated arc, each one precisely positioned so that their occupants looked naturally downward at the central chair. The floor between the chair and the crescent was open and empty, a distance that could not be crossed casually. Every design decision in the room said the same thing: you are the smaller party in this conversation. I walked to the small chair and sat down. The air smelled of something faintly floral and faintly metallic, a manufactured calm, as if the room itself was dispensing mild reassurance. I breathed it in and did not feel reassured. Grand Speaker Elithari, the council's presiding officer and not the same Elithari as my escort, sat at the center of the crescent. The coincidence of name had caught me when I reviewed the session roster, and I had asked about it. The translated approximation, I was told, could render differently rendered sounds as the same syllable. The actual names were distinct. I had filed that information and moved on. She was ancient, in the way that the word begins to lose meaning past a certain threshold. Her face held deep lines that moved with genuine expression rather than with age alone, and her eyes were a color the translation system had flagged as having no close human equivalent. She looked at me the way a senior teacher looks at a junior student who has arrived late on an important day, patient and already slightly disappointed. "Ambassador Voss," she said, and the translation washed over me like warm water moving through a room. "We welcome you to the Council Chamber of the 12 Worlds. We trust your journey was comfortable." "It was," I said. "Thank you." She let that hang in the air for exactly 1 second before continuing, as if I had not spoken. This was, I came to understand, a deliberate technique common to every senior member of the Council. It was a way of communicating that your words had been received but were not required, that the conversation had a shape already, and your responses were noted but would not alter that shape. What followed was 40 minutes of formal recitation. Grand Speaker Elithary read, in careful and precise and unhurried terms, the full catalogue of humanity's violations of galactic law. The list was considerably longer than I had expected. Unauthorized terraforming of a planetary body listed under Galactic Preservation Code 7. Aggressive contact with 3 separate survey probes belonging to Council member species. Failure to respond to 17 formal notifications of legal standing delivered via signal relay across a 60-year period. Maintenance of a nuclear arsenal classified under Galactic Weapons Prohibition Statute 3. Unauthorized development of propulsion technology in violation of development restrictions placed on emerging civilizations. Continued expansion of orbital infrastructure above the permitted threshold for species below Category 4 designation. 3 separate instances of signal emissions that had been interpreted as surveillance directed at Council member vessels. The last item on the list was not a law violation but a behavioral note. Humanity had been assessed by 3 separate Council evaluation teams as demonstrating persistent oppositional tendency, which was a phrase I had not encountered in any of the 412 pages, and which told me more about how the Council thought than anything else in the room. I sat with my hands folded and heard all of it without speaking. When Elithary finished, she gestured toward the tablet with a motion so practiced it barely registered as movement. "The submission accord sets out a clear and achievable path forward," she said. "Earth will decommission its orbital assets above the permitted threshold, surrender full documentation of all advanced weapons technology, accept a supervisory council for a period of 100 standard years, and demonstrate measurable compliance with galactic law at each 10-year review. At the end of the supervisory period, humanity will be formally assessed for full membership in the galactic community. This is the standard process. It has served 800 years of galactic development well." She was not asking. She was narrating what was about to happen. I looked at the tablet. The accord was written in 15 languages, including 2 distinct versions of English, 1 formal and 1 colloquial, as if the drafters had anticipated that I might ask for something simpler. I picked it up. I read it from the first line to the last, every clause, every subarticle, every definition section and appendix. This took 8 minutes. I was aware, throughout those 8 minutes, of the complete stillness in the chamber. 12 ancient species watching a human read a document. I did not hurry. Hurrying would have implied that their time was more valuable than my comprehension. When I finished, I set the tablet on the table. Then I slid it, carefully and without any gesture of emotion, back toward the center, away from my side of the table, away from me. "I have a question," I said. Something shifted behind Elithary's eyes, a small recalibration barely perceptible. "You may ask." "What happens," I said, "if I decline to sign?" The silence that came after was a different material than all the silences that had come before it. The earlier silences had been administrative, the quiet of a process moving through its established steps. This silence had texture. It moved through the chamber in a wave, touching each delegate in sequence, registering on faces and in postures that I had no complete reference for reading, but could feel in the air. Something that had been assumed was no longer assumed. Grand Speaker Elithary took her time before answering. She was far too experienced to allow visible surprise. "If Earth declines the accord," she said, "the Council moves to enforcement measures. Compliance at that point is no longer a matter of Earth's preference." I nodded slowly, as if this was simply information I was filing away. "I understand. Thank you for the clarity." I stood up. "I would like to thank the Council for the time and thoroughness of this session. I will relay everything that has been discussed to the government of Earth in full." I paused for 1 moment. "I will not be signing the accord today." Nobody in the chamber moved. I let the sentence stand on its own. I did not follow it with apology or qualification or an offer to revisit the question at a later time. I picked up my bag from beside the chair and I looked up at the crescent, at 12 sets of eyes representing civilizations that had been expanding across the galaxy, since before human beings understood that the Earth was not the center of the universe. I want to be precise, I said, because precision had always seemed important to me, and it seemed especially important now. I am not declining on a technicality. I am not requesting additional review time. I am declining, clearly. On behalf of my government and my species, I held their attention for one more second. I hope the session is productive from here. Good day. I walked to the door. Every step took exactly the same amount of time as every other step. The door opened when I reached it. I stepped through into the white corridor beyond. The door closed behind me with a sound that seemed to belong to a specific category of finality. The corridor was long and silent and absolutely white. My footsteps made clean sounds against the floor. My hands, which I checked because I was curious about my own state, were completely steady. I found a corner near the communications bay, sat down against the wall, and recorded a transmission to Earth. I kept it short because the important information was simple. This is Ambassador Voss, transmitting from the Council station. The Council presented the submission accord as expected. I declined it on your behalf. Grand Speaker Elithary has indicated that non-compliance will lead to enforcement action. I expect the Council will seek a formal response within 72 to 96 hours. End transmission. I sent it. I sat in the white corridor of a space station many light years from home, and listened to the hum of translation systems in the walls. And I thought about the tablet sitting in the chamber behind the closed door. I thought about how it had been waiting before I arrived. I thought about 800 years of species walking through that door and signing, one after another, each one looking at the tablet and doing the mathematics of resistance and survival, and deciding that the mathematics came out in favor of signing. I had done that mathematics too. The answer I got was different. The certainty they had carried into this meeting, the complete and unexamined expectation that the outcome was already settled, was the first thing we had taken from them. I got up, straightened my jacket, and went to find my quarters. There was work to do. The transmission reached Earth in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I was told this later, along with the information that 14 people were in the secure communications room when it arrived, that they played it twice, and that the subsequent 6 hours were the most densely scheduled period in the history of the Interstellar Defense Coordination Council. 12 governments that had agreed on almost nothing in living memory agreed on this with a speed that had apparently startled even the people who had been hoping for it. The response was 4 words: "Come home, we are ready." I had not been certain what to expect. Some part of me had imagined a more complicated message, instructions to reconsider, suggestions that the diplomatic situation required more careful management, gentle recommendations that I return to the chamber and express regret for the misunderstanding. The 4 words were better than anything I had imagined. They told me everything I needed to know about what had been decided and what had already been in motion long before I sat down in that small chair. The Varathi escort vessel that carried me back to the boundary of Earth's solar system was a different vessel than the one that had brought me out. The crew was more numerous and their behavior toward me had changed in a way I noticed but could not fully categorize. They were not hostile. They were not warm. They were attentive in the way that people are attentive towards something they are reassessing, and I caught more than one crew member watching me across rooms, with an expression that had the specific quality of someone updating a prior estimate. I said nothing about this, I read. I slept when I could, I prepared. At the boundary, a human transport was waiting. A fast courier ship, military-built and unmarked, with a crew of 6 who received me with the quiet professionalism of people who had been briefed extensively and trusted to act on that briefing without ceremony. The pilot, a woman named Nina, told me the transit time was 30 hours and offered me coffee. Real coffee, ground from actual beans, not the pressurized powder the Varathi vessel had provided. I took it with both hands and drank it standing by the small observation port and watched Earth's star grow larger against the dark. 30 hours later, I walked down a ramp into a facility I had never been told existed. It was 300 meters underground in the Swiss mountains, accessed through a series of checkpoints that verified my identity with increasing precision at each stage. And when I finally stepped into the main briefing room, I found the kind of gathered attention that only exists in spaces where the stakes have been declared and accepted, and everyone present has chosen to be there. Director Lena Holt met me at the door. She was a small woman in her late 50s, gray-eyed, with the posture of someone who had been making decisions with significant consequences for a long time and had made peace with the weight of that. She shook my hand, the way people shake hands when they mean it rather than when they are performing the action for an audience. Good work, she said. Those 2 words settled something in my chest that I had not realized needed settling. I thanked her and let her walk me through the room. I saw faces from news files and position reports, generals and research leads and policy architects, whose titles I knew, and several whose function existed in the space between official roles where actual authority often lives. I saw engineers in their 30s with the specific energy of people who have been working on something difficult for years and are finally close to the moment when the work becomes relevant. I saw one face I did not recognize, a young woman near a wall display, explaining something to 2 engineers with the focused precision of someone making a clear and detailed point and not leaving until it was understood. She had short dark hair and there was a substance on her fingers that looked like dried adhesive, or possibly a compound I had no civilian name for. Dr. Sarah Mao, Director Holt said quietly, tracking my glance. She built the most important thing we have. You will want to remember everything she says. The briefing ran for 4 hours. I will try to convey what I understood from it, though I am aware that I am a diplomat, not an engineer or a weapons analyst, and my understanding of the technical material is the understanding of someone who has read about oceans rather than sailed them. Earth had been watching the Galactic Council for 60 years. Not through any official channel, not through any program listed on any public ledger, but through a network of long-range sensor arrays and signal intelligence operations that had been assembled quietly, expanded quietly, and maintained quietly across multiple governments and multiple changes of administration. The 17 notifications that Elithari had cited during her recitation of humanity's offenses, the ones that had been transmitted across 60 years and apparently ignored. We had received every single one. We had analyzed each of them and reached a collective determination, shared across governments that disagreed on almost every other subject, that responding and acknowledging and beginning the process of formal engagement would start a clock that we were not yet ready to have started. We needed to understand what we were dealing with before we dealt with it, Director Holt said, moving through 6 decades of compiled data on a display that covered an entire wall. The Council has brought 231 species into the fold in 800 years. Every single one signed the submission accord within the first formal engagement. The supervisory period is framed as a development period. In practice, it functions as integration. By the time the 100 years are complete, the species in question has adopted Council infrastructure, Council communication protocols, Council legal frameworks. The dependency is structural. It does not require enforcement because by the end it is simply how things work. She looked at the room. We decided this was not acceptable. We decided this before most of the people in this room were born. She moved to the strategic material. The Varathi Armada, currently positioned at the edge of our solar system, 40 vessels representing the Council's standard enforcement package for non-compliant emerging civilizations, was formidable by every metric the Council applied to these situations. It was the kind of force that, in 800 years of recorded deployments, had never needed to fire a single weapon. Its presence had always been sufficient. The species it was deployed against looked at 40 Council vessels and did the only math available to them and arrived at the expected answer. We had done different math. We had been doing different math for a long time. Dr. Sarah Mao took over at this point. She was, I discovered as she spoke, the engineering lead for a project designated the Strategic Convergence Array, a name so understated it bordered on deliberate misdirection. The array was a network of orbital defense installations distributed across the entire solar system, embedded in asteroid bodies, positioned within the ice of outer moons, buried beneath the surface terrain of 3 separate planetary bodies, and painted, in terms of their thermal and electromagnetic signature, with the precise fingerprint of natural geological formations. We studied their sensor technology in detail, Dr. Mao said. She spoke the way people speak when they have explained something many times, and have refined the explanation to its most efficient form. We built every installation to be invisible to their system specifically, not to all Sol sensor systems, to theirs. We analyzed every probe they sent through this system over the past 40 years, and we calibrated our concealment to the exact detection parameters of those probes. She paused. Their most recent survey probe flew within 200 kilometers of 17 of our primary installations. It reported nothing anomalous. She pulled up a 3-dimensional model of the solar system. Points of light appeared across it in sequence, dozens of them, then more, until the display looked like someone had scattered handfuls of small stars through the familiar shape of our neighborhood. I stopped counting somewhere past 80 installations. We also, she continued, spent a great deal of time understanding the Council species we could observe, their hull materials, their power routing architectures, the resonance frequencies at which their defensive systems operate, and at which, if you apply the right input at the right amplitude, those systems fail in specific predictable ways. She looked directly at me. We can stop their ships, any of their ships. We can do it without destroying them. Why does that matter? I asked. It was not a challenge. I genuinely wanted to understand her thinking. If we destroy their ships, she said, we are a threat that the Council categorizes and responds to with everything it has, which is considerable. If we stop their ships, precisely, with surgical accuracy, demonstrating complete knowledge of their systems and complete control of the outcome, we become something different. She paused to find the right words. We become a fact about the universe that the Council has to incorporate into its model. A threat can be escalated against. A fact has to be understood. I sat with that for a moment. And the decision not to destroy them is also a message. Yes, she said, the most important one. I thought about the briefing materials I had read on the escort vessel, about the emotional register of the session in the council chamber, about the tablet waiting, about Elithari's voice, unhurried and absolute, narrating outcomes rather than proposing them. They have never actually fought anyone, I said. Director Holt answered. Not in 800 years. They have deployed the Armada 43 times. Every species saw it and signed. The Armada has never actually engaged. The Council has never had to make the transition from demonstrating force to using it, because the demonstration has always been enough. She met my eyes. They are very good at demonstrating force. They have no experience of what happens when it does not work. The deadline from the Council arrived while I was still in the briefing. 72 hours for Earth to respond with formal compliance. The message was broadcast on all Council frequencies, which meant every monitored civilization in a significant portion of the galaxy received it. Simultaneously, the Council was not trying to intimidate us privately. They were creating a public record. They wanted witnesses to Earth's surrender, and they wanted those witnesses to understand the process clearly, so that it could serve as a visible object lesson for any other young civilization watching. Earth's response was drafted over the following 24 hours in a room that grew progressively more tired and more focused in equal measure. I was one of 11 people on the drafting committee. We worked through 46 versions. 42 of them were discarded for being too aggressive, too conciliatory, too technical, or too ambiguous. 3 were discarded for reasons I still do not entirely understand, but that the linguists in the room felt strongly about. The final version was 312 words long. It was not aggressive. It did not threaten or boast or perform. It stated, with the measured directness of a species that had spent 60 years thinking carefully about this moment, that Earth recognized no external authority over its own sovereignty, that any vessel entering our solar system without prior agreement would be treated as a hostile incursion, that humanity remained willing and genuinely interested in fair and equal diplomatic engagement, and that we proposed negotiations between sovereign parties rather than the existing framework of compliance and supervision. The final line of the statement was written by Owen Clark, a retired linguist who had devoted 30 years to studying council communication patterns and who had fought for his version of the last sentence against objections from 3 generals and 2 senior policy advisors. He had simply said, I know how they think, trust me. Eventually they did. We have made peace gladly, the statement ended. We will make war thoroughly. The broadcast went out on all frequencies, every receiver the council used, which meant everyone watching received it simultaneously. Earth went quiet and waited. I stood outside the facility entrance in the cold mountain air after the broadcast, and looked up through a gap in the clouds at the moon, which was half full and entirely ordinary, and the most reassuring thing I had looked at in weeks. Somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the orbit of the outermost planet, 40 Varathi vessels were listening to those words being processed through their translation systems. I wondered what the council would feel, receiving that message. I wondered if there was a word in any of their languages for the specific sensation of a certainty departing. I went back inside. The work was not finished. The Armada crossed the boundary line at 0347, station time, and I was awake when it happened because I had not been able to sleep. I was aboard the Harrington, a defense coordination vessel that served as Earth's command and observation platform for the engagement. My role was civilian observer and diplomatic liaison, which in practice meant I had access to the best sensor feed on any non-combat vessel in the system, a standing order to stay out of the way of everyone who was actually doing something useful. Captain Olivia Oduya had briefed me the previous evening with the precise economy of someone who had spent 3 years planning for this day and had eliminated everything from her communication that was not directly operational. You are here to observe and to record, she said. You will be a secondary observation room throughout the engagement. You will not speak to crew members during active operations. You will not touch any control surface for any reason. She looked at me steadily for a moment. Do you have questions? One, I said. Are we going to be all right? She regarded me with the kind of eyes that accumulate steadiness through years of exposure to difficult information. Yes, she said, we are. I slept 4 hours after that, which was 4 more than I would have managed without her answer. The secondary observation room had a curved display wall that showed a composite feed from Earth's entire sensor network, updated continuously, rendered in a format designed to give a non-specialist a clear picture of the tactical situation. When I arrived at 0330, the Armada was already visible as 40 distinct signatures arranged in the formation Doctor had predicted weeks earlier. A forward spearhead of 6 heavy vessels, 2 flanking wings of lighter craft, reserve units positioned at the rear. It was a textbook Council enforcement formation, clean and practiced and designed to be read easily from a distance, so that the species on the receiving end understood exactly how much force was present and could calculate accordingly. I looked at it and thought about what was underneath the moons and inside the asteroids and sleeping in the dark between the signatures on that display, and I thought, they have never seen anything they were actually afraid of. The Armada advanced with the deliberate pace of a force that expects the other party to have a great deal of second thoughts in the time it takes to arrive. The formation held its geometry precisely, each vessel maintaining exact intervals, communication signals pulsing between them in the regular pattern of a coordinated body operating according to a settled plan. They were not rushing. There was no need to rush. They crossed the declared boundary line at 034712. At 034719, 7 seconds later, the array activated. On the display, the solar system came alive. Every installation, from the inner system to the far outer boundary, registered simultaneously, their signals shifting from dormant to active in a single coordinated pulse. What had appeared on any sensor as natural terrain, as cold rock and ancient ice, was suddenly a network, dozens of active signatures, then more. The final count that registered on the Harrington's display was 91 active installations. I watched the Armada's formation hold for 4 seconds after the array lit up. I counted those seconds. In those 4 seconds, I imagined the command vessels processing what their sensors were now showing them, the communications between ships, the urgent recalculation of every assumption that formation had been built upon. 4 seconds of absolute certainty becoming 4 seconds of a different kind of thinking entirely. At 034723, the first exchange of the engagement occurred. The lead vessel, a Varathi dreadnought 4 kilometers in length, with a hull specification rated against every known weapons system in Council inventory, was struck at 034731. The strike was a focused electromagnetic pulse, delivered at the resonance frequency of the dreadnought's primary power routing system, a frequency that had taken Dr. Mao's team 8 years to calculate and verify. The dreadnought did not break apart. Its hull was not breached. The crew was, according to every reading the Harrington's instruments could take, unharmed. What happened was that every external system on the vessel went dark in the span of a single second, simultaneously, as if a switch had been thrown by someone who knew exactly where to find it, and the ship drifted to a halt in the silence of its own dead systems, its emergency lighting a thin amber glow against the dark. The second Council vessel was stopped differently, a targeted disruption of its navigation and propulsion interface that left weapons and life support intact. The third vessel, differently again, a power cascade through its weapons grid that locked every system in a safe state shutdown. The fourth, fifth, sixth, each addressed in a different way, each demonstrating a different instrument from the ensemble Earth had assembled over 60 years of careful preparation. It was not a battle. I want to be precise about this. A battle implies 2 forces engaging each other with uncertain outcomes. This was a demonstration. Earth was showing the Council, in real time, in front of every relay system the Council had pointed at our solar system, exactly how thoroughly and exactly how completely the previous 800 years of assumptions about the shape of the universe had become inaccurate. The Armada's flanking wings attempted to regroup and advance at 0351. The network responded without any perceptible pause, as if the Armada's adaptation was itself a variable that had been solved for in advance. 3 more vessels in the advancing wing went dark within 40 seconds of beginning their movement. The wing pulled back. At 0355, distress communications from several of the disabled vessels began reaching the Harrington's receivers. Captain Oduya instructed the communications team to record but not respond. "Not yet," she said from somewhere behind me. I had heard her voice throughout the engagement in brief, precise instructions to her crew, and at no point had it carried anything other than the quality of someone entirely within the scope of a situation they had prepared for completely. I watched the display. I watched the signatures of disabled vessels drifting, each one still broadcasting emergency identification. each one carrying a crew that was alive and unharmed in the amber glow of its backup systems. I thought about those crews. I thought about the certainty they had carried out here with them. The absolute, inherited, institutional certainty of 800 unbroken years of a particular kind of result. At 0401, the Armada began to withdraw. It was not a collapse. I want to be precise about this also. They withdrew with discipline, the functional vessels moving to assist the disabled ones, recovering what could be recovered, and pulling back toward the boundary in an organized sequence that told me a great deal about the quality of their command structure. They were absorbing a fact about the universe they had not known before today, and they were doing it without falling apart, which took a kind of steadiness that I respected genuinely. I watched them go and felt something I had not expected to feel. It was a feeling close to sadness. Not for Earth, we were intact. We had done exactly what we had prepared to do, and we had done it cleanly. The sadness was for the certainty departing from those ships as they withdrew. For the thing they had brought here with them, the unexamined assumption that had lived in the formation and the approach and the tablet waiting on the table before I arrived. The certainty was gone now, and something that loses its certainty, regardless of how powerful or how ancient, loses a specific kind of innocence that cannot be recovered. I was still holding that thought when Captain Oduya came into the observation room. She stood beside me and looked at the display. 2 vessels are non-recoverable by their fleet without significant support, she said. Their crews are intact. Medical support has already been dispatched. She paused. Non-military personnel, it was in the plan. Good, I said. The word was simple, but I meant it in a way that went some depth below simple. Oduya looked at the display for another moment. The relay station has been transmitting since this began. The council chamber watched everything in real time. Yes, they will want to negotiate now. I looked at the display. The Armada crossing back over its own boundary. The array still active across the system. 2 council vessels drifting in the quiet dark. Human medical teams already moving toward them across the distance. They will reach out through formal channels, I said. They will phrase the request carefully so it does not read as a request. What will you tell them? I thought about the crescent of seats, the manufactured calm in the air, the tablet on the table waiting, the 40 minutes of careful recitation. Ellie Lithery's voice, unhurried and absolute, narrating an outcome that had been decided before I arrived. I will tell them, I said, to ask politely. Oduya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ambassador. There was something in how she said it, just the word, that carried the weight of a longer sentence. I turned to look at her. She met my eyes directly. Good work. I looked back at the display, at the solar system still lit with the array that had been sleeping in the dark for 2 decades, waiting for exactly this. We all did good work, I said. All 60 years of it. The chamber looked the same. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in, and for a moment it produced a specific disorientation. The way a familiar room can feel different after you have spent time in it knowing something you did not know before. The ceiling was still its impossible transparent sky. The crescent of seats was still arranged with the same geometric precision. The air still carried the same manufactured calm. The translation systems hummed in the walls with the same seamless constancy. But the room had changed in a way that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions. The weight of it had shifted. The particular kind of gravity that had been operating in this chamber when I first sat in the small chair, the gravity of unchallenged authority expressing itself as architecture and ritual, was different now. Not absent, different. Like a room where the furniture has not been moved, but the light is coming from another direction. Everything was in its place and the place felt different. I walked in alone. The same single chair waited in the center of the floor. I sat down in it and placed my bag beside me and looked up at the crescent. Every seat was occupied. There were more observers than before, standing in 2 rows at the back of the chamber, recording devices visible. Several senior advisors stood at the edges of the crescent itself, something that had not been the case at the first session. The galaxy was watching, as before, but the nature of the watching had changed. Before, they had been watching what they expected to be a formal processing. Now they were watching something they did not have a category for yet. Nobody had brought a tablet. Grand Speaker Elithari was in her seat. She looked, in ways I was now calibrated enough to read, older than when I had last been in this room. Not dramatically, but there was a quality to her stillness that had not been there before. She held herself with the same discipline as always. Beneath the discipline, something had been redistributed. I thought of a word I had learned once from a structural engineer, reloading. The way a bridge redistributes weight after one of its elements has changed. A counselor from the Sheth Collective spoke first. The Sheth were one of the older species, known for long memory and careful language, and their representative had the bearing of someone who chose every word the way you choose a foothold on uncertain ground. His voice through the translation came measured and very precise. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "you actually declared war on the Galactic Council." It sat in the air between us, not exactly a question, not exactly an accusation. Something more like a reckoning made out loud. "No," I said. "The Council declared war on Earth. We simply did not lose." The silence that followed was the deepest I had experienced in this chamber, which was significant given the silences I had already experienced in it. It was the silence of a very large body of very intelligent beings absorbing a sentence and finding that they had no immediate answer for it, not because the sentence was complicated but because it was accurate. Elithari spoke. "You are here," she said, "because the Council wishes to understand the path forward." "I know," I said. "I am here for the same reason." I reached into my bag and placed 3 documents on the table in front of me. Physical documents. Paper, printed in a human facility, carrying the specific quality of something made by hands. I had chosen paper deliberately, no crystalline tablet, no data interface, nothing that spoke of their systems or their language or their preferred methods. Paper, the material of a species that had been writing things down, for a small fraction of the time any of these delegates had been alive. "The first document," I said, "is a complete historical record of every species placed under a submission accord by this council in the past 4 centuries. I gave them a moment with that. We compiled it from publicly accessible council archives and cross-referenced it with independent signal intelligence gathered over 60 years. We had 3 separate teams verify the accuracy of the compilation. It is correct. I watched the chamber. I watched what moved behind faces I still did not have complete reference for reading. And I recognized what I was seeing anyway because the response to uncomfortable accuracy looks roughly the same, regardless of the biology of the face displaying it. The second document is a complete technical inventory of Earth's current defense and strategic capabilities. Every system, every installation, every active development project, full specifications." I paused. "This is not a threat. We are sharing it, freely and completely, because we believe this council deserves to understand exactly what it was dealing with. And because we have nothing to hide from people, we are proposing to treat as equals." The sound that moved through the chamber at that point was not speech, but it was not silence either. The third document is a proposed charter for the relationship between Earth and the Galactic Council, and by extension, a model framework for how the Council might approach contact with young species going forward. I set my hands flat on the table. It is built on a foundational principle that I have not been able to locate in any current Council law or precedent, which is that sovereignty is not a condition granted by those with more power to those with less. It is a condition that exists independently of any grant. What varies is whether it is recognized. We are proposing that recognition become the standard, rather than the exception for those strong enough to demand it. Elithari looked at the 3 documents on the table. Then she looked at me with the specific quality of attention she had been giving me since I entered this chamber, which was the quality of someone conducting a continuous reassessment. "You are proposing," she said with care, "that this council fundamentally reconsider the basis on which it has operated for 800 years. "Yes," I said. "On the basis of the experience of a single species that has been spacefaring for less than a century. On the basis of the experience of every species that has signed a submission accord," I said. I was digressive when I said it. I was exact. I have read their histories. The Council administers with genuine intent toward positive outcomes. I believe that. But intent and outcome diverge over time when the structure itself creates dependency rather than capability. The species that signed those accords did not flourish on Council terms. They were maintained. There is a difference, and it has been borne silently by civilizations that had no mechanism to say so. I looked along the crescent. I am saying so. On their behalf as well as ours. The session continued for 2 hours. 7 delegates spoke at length. The questions they asked ranged from operational, how Earth intended to interact with Council legal frameworks going forward, to philosophical, what humanity understood by the concept of sovereignty and whether we considered it absolute. I answered every question directly. I did not soften answers to make them more comfortable. I did not harden them to make them more impressive. I gave the most accurate answer I had to each question asked. The ancient Keth delegate, who had been present at both sessions and had said nothing at either one until now, leaned forward in his seat partway through the second hour. He was the oldest entity in the room by any measurement I could apply. His voice through the translation system was quiet in the way that things are, quiet when they do not need volume to carry weight. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "what does Earth want?" I paused, because this was the question. Not what terms were we demanding, not what were our conditions, but what did we actually want, at the real center of it, stripped of everything diplomatic and strategic. "A seat at this table," I said, "a genuine one, with full voting rights and full voice, Not as a courtesy and not as a provisional arrangement pending reassessment. A permanent seat held on the same terms as any other member. I let that stand for a moment. We want to be part of what this community is building across the galaxy. We have always wanted that. That desire has not changed since the first night a human being looked up and wondered what was out there. We are still willing to pursue it, but we will not purchase our place by surrendering the quality that makes us worth including. A pause moved through the chamber. And if the council does not accept these terms, Elithari asked, then nothing much changes, I said. Earth continues. We are not going anywhere. We have time and we have patience and we have, as has been demonstrated, the capability to protect our own space. We are not asking out of need. We are asking because we believe this community is better with us genuinely in it than outside it. I looked at her directly, but I think this council is also intelligent enough and honest enough to recognize that the available paths forward are fewer than they might appear and clearer. Elithari was still for a long time, not the stillness of someone formulating a counter-argument. The stillness of someone who has arrived at a recognition and is deciding what to do with. Then she reached out and picked up the first document, the historical record. She opened it and read the first page slowly. I watched her read it. I watched the quality of her stillness as she read. When she set it down and looked at it, her expression carried something I recognized because I had worn it myself, in a different context, a long time ago. The expression of accurate information, meeting the honest acknowledgement that it is accurate. The vote came 40 minutes after the final question was asked. The motions to dissolve the submission accord, enter formal negotiations with Earth under a framework of sovereign equality, and convene a working group to review the proposed new charter passed 17-2. The two delegates who voted against were accompanied out of the chamber by their own delegations before the session officially closed. I did not watch them go. When the room had mostly cleared, Elithari remained in her seat. I remained in mine. The space between us was the same space it had always been in this chamber. The feeling of it was entirely different. You frightened us, she said. Good, I said. Fear is the beginning of respect. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not as a concession, as an acknowledgement. I picked up my bag. I left the 3 documents on the table. I walked toward the door, and when I reached it and it opened and the corridor beyond appeared, it looked different than it had looked the last 2 times I had stood in this spot. The white was the same, the silence was the same. But the door I was walking through had changed. This is a private log, recorded for my daughter Nora, who is 11 years old and asked me to write down what it was actually like. Not the version in the official record, not what I say when someone points a camera at me. The actual thing, as clearly as I can render it. It has been 1 year since the new Galactic Accord was signed. The signing ceremony took place aboard a neutral station positioned in a system equidistant from Earth and the Council's seat. 37 delegates attended in person, and another 14 participated via relay. I attended as a signatory on behalf of Earth. Grand Speaker Elithari attended as the Council's primary representative. We shook hands at the signing table because I had specifically requested this in the pre-ceremony negotiations, and it had taken 40 minutes of back and forth before it was agreed, and every camera and relay system present recorded the image of a human diplomat and a Varathi council leader, shaking hands across a document neither of their species could have written a year ago. It was a handshake, an old gesture, human in origin, simple in execution. It went out on every frequency the council broadcast on, which meant it was received by every monitored civilization in a considerable portion of known space. I chose it deliberately, not for the symbolism, though the symbolism was useful, for what it communicated about physicality and presence, and the specific intimacy of contact between equals, which is different in quality from the contact between parties who have accepted different positions. It mattered. More than I can cleanly explain. It mattered. Earth now holds a permanent seat on the council with full voting rights. The seat was created as a new entry, distinct from the 12 original seats of the founding species, which had itself required 3 weeks of negotiation and resulted in a legal framework that several council members told me afterward was the most significant revision of council structure in 3 centuries. I believe them. I also believe that 3 centuries is exactly the right interval for a structure to be revised when it has developed a gap between its stated purpose and its actual effects. The submission accord was formally dissolved and removed from all active council records. In what I understand to be the informal communication between council members, which Dr. Mao's team continues to monitor as a routine matter, there is a significant ongoing discussion about how to characterize what happened. The characterizations range from enforcement failure to negotiated resolution to correction, depending on who is speaking and to whom. Elithari's faction uses the word correction. I find this encouraging. It is the framing of people who understand that the problem was in the structure, not in the individuals involved, and who are prepared to fix the structure rather than assign blame and move on. The two Varathi vessels that had been disabled and left drifting in our solar system during the engagement were returned to their fleet 3 weeks after the accord was signed. Their crews had been guests, which was a word I had been careful to use in every communication about their situation and which I had made certain was reflected in every logistical arrangement made for them. They were housed in a research station near Jupiter's outer moons. They were given access to communication equipment. They were fed well, given access to information about their own situation, and treated, in every interaction they had with every human being they encountered, as people who were someone's crewmates and someone's family, and who had done their jobs and ended up in an unusual situation through no particular fault of their own. This was not a strategic decision, or rather it began as a strategic decision, and it continued as something more instinctual. The specific way that we treat people when we hold every advantage over them is a test we take constantly, and the score accumulates over time into the thing we actually are, separate from what we say we are. The commander of the two disabled vessels, a Varathi officer named Derek San, sent a personal message to Captain Oduya 6 months after returning home. I know it arrived because Oduya told me. She did not tell me what it said, except that it had been respectful and that she had written back. I chose not to ask for more than that. Some communications are between the two people who sent them. 6 civilizations that had signed submission accords under duress contacted Earth in the year following the new accord. They used indirect channels, carefully worded approaches that acknowledged the political sensitivity of reaching, but the substance was consistent. They wanted to know how we had done it, what the method was, what the moment had looked like from the inside. I wrote back to each of them personally, which took more time than I had, and I tried to tell them the truth rather than a version of the truth, shaped to be more impressive or more exportable. The truth is that there was no single method and no special moment. There was 60 years of patient work done by people who did not know if it would ever matter. There was a collective agreement, reached across governments that agreed on very little else, that knowing the situation clearly before responding to it was more valuable than responding quickly from incomplete information. There was a decision to build what we needed quietly, without announcing it, because announcing it would have started a process we were not ready for. There was the recognition, which sounds simple and is actually very difficult to hold on to consistently, that the value of a civilization is not determined by how old it is or how large, but by what it understands and what it chooses to do with that understanding. And there was the moment when I picked up my bag and walked out of the chamber the first time, which I want to be honest about. I did not know that it would work out the way it did. I knew what we had built. I knew we had prepared seriously and carefully. I did not know that it would be enough. I said no in that chamber, not from certainty of outcome, but from the judgment that the alternative was worse. Regardless of outcome, that a species that surrenders something it has not been given the genuine opportunity to defend has surrendered something more fundamental than the specific thing being demanded. I want Nora to understand this. I want her to know that her father was frightened in that corridor, sitting on the floor with his back against a white wall on a space station far from home, that the steady hands were maintained, not natural, that the confidence in my voice in the transmission I sent was the confidence of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it, not the confidence of someone who knew what was coming. Those are different things. The second kind is rare and not entirely reliable. The first kind is available to anyone willing to pay for it with preparation and honesty about their own fear. I think about the Harrington's observation room often. I think about watching the solar system wake up, all those installations coming alive simultaneously, the Armada's formation holding for 4 seconds before the first response. I think about Dr. Mao explaining resonance frequencies in a briefing room while paint dried on her fingers. I think about Director Holt's 2 words at a door. I think about Owen Clark arguing for 1 sentence over the objections of generals. I think about the medical transport leaving the Harrington immediately after the engagement, moving toward 2 drifting vessels in the dark. That moment is the one I keep returning to. It was in the plan, as Captain Oduya said. We had decided before the engagement that regardless of the outcome, we would extend immediate care to any crew in danger. We had decided it not as a calculation but as a standard, and the difference matters. A calculation can be revised if the numbers change. A standard does not revise because the circumstances are inconvenient. It was, Dr. Mao had said, the second message. The first message was the array lighting up. The second was the transport leaving. Both were true. Both were necessary. The first said, we know what we are doing. The second, who we are. I believe we need both, always. I believe we need to be capable and to remain ourselves in the exercise of that capability. And I believe the maintenance of the second is harder and more important than the development of the first. Because a species that becomes powerful and loses its character in the process of becoming powerful has not won anything that matters. It has simply moved into a different kind of failure. The kind that takes longer to become visible and is more expensive to correct. The new accord has produced a working group charged with reviewing the existing submission accords held by the 6 civilizations that contacted Earth. This process will take time and will involve negotiations that are complicated by the structural dependencies that have accumulated over decades of supervised membership. I am not naive about how long this takes or how much resistance it will encounter from council members whose institutional interests are tied to the existing arrangements. But the working group exists, the mandate is genuine, and the precedent has been set. Change that begins as an argument becomes, if the argument is correct and the people making it stay in the room, eventually a structure. I stay in the room. Nora called 2 nights ago. She was at the kitchen table with her schoolwork around her and a cup of tea cooling beside her hand. She has her mother's eyes, and looking at them through the video feed from a station that is currently positioned 3 days' travel from Earth, produces a specific quality of ache that I would not trade for anything. She asked me if I had been scared. I thought about it, the way I think about things when the person asking deserves accuracy more than comfort. I thought about the white corridor. I thought about the tablet sliding back across the table. I thought about 4 words arriving 11 minutes after my transmission. We are ready. Yes, I was quiet for a moment. Then were you scared when you said no, especially then? But you said it anyway. Yes. She thought about this for a long moment in the way that she thinks, visibly and without hurry, working through the parts of something until it holds together. Then she nodded, as if the thing had resolved itself to her satisfaction, and she went back to her schoolwork. I ended the call and sat for a long time in the quiet of my quarters, looking at the viewport and the stars beyond it, which are the same stars they have always been, and will be long after every species currently, arguing about sovereignty and recognition, and the terms of belonging has resolved its arguments one way or another. I do not know everything that comes next. I know there will be difficult sessions and deliberate reversals, and moments when the agreement seems fragile against the weight of entrenched habits. I know that some of what we changed will slowly be pressured back toward its previous shape by people who find the previous shape more comfortable. I know that the work of keeping something true requires the same effort every day that it took to make it true the first time, possibly more. What I know that is smaller and more durable than all of that is this. Every species that has ever looked up and decided the light was worth moving toward has faced the same question at some point, in some version. The question is not whether you are ready. You are never entirely ready. The question is whether you believe your place at the table is something you are owed by virtue of reaching for it, or something you must ask permission for from whoever arrived before you. We answered that question. We answered it with 60 years of careful work done in the dark, and with a tablet slid back across a table, and with a solar system that woke up when it needed to, and with a medical transport that departed without hesitation, toward people who had come to enforce our submission. We answered it with every individual decision made by every person who understood what was at stake and showed up for it, anyway, frightened and capable and unwilling to be defined by someone else's assessment of what we were worth. The stars are not ours. I hold that clearly. The universe does not belong to any civilization that has the reach to call it theirs. It belongs to itself, and it is large enough that belonging is not a zero-sum condition. There is room. There has always been room. What changes is whether the ones who arrived earlier are willing to acknowledge the room, and whether the ones arriving later are willing to claim it on their own terms, rather than the terms they are offered. The right to stand under those stars, to look at them without asking anyone's permission to find them beautiful, to call them part of the sky that belongs to every conscious being that can look up. That right we have earned, not through aggression, not through luck, but through the long, patient, frightened, determined work of a species that looked at a tablet waiting on a table and decided that the pen was not ours to pick up. We will not give that back, and we are only getting started.